Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. Moloch and the Ancient Bull. There was no pagan deity quite as despised by nearly every biblical prophet and Roman senator as Moloch. Moloch was the Canaanite god of child sacrifice. He had a bronze body with a furnace in his belly, which was used for roasting children. The people who worshipped this awful deity were known as the cult of Moloch, and it's been said, although no real physical evidence has ever been found, that they boiled children alive inside of an enormous bronze statue. The statue had the body of a man and the head of a bull, and archaeologists are trying to search for clues of actual sacrifice. The Canaanites were not the only ancient people who worshipped a great bull god, nor were they the only ones who practiced human sacrifice. In Carthage, what is now Tunisia, child sacrifice was so common that they had a sacred grove and a temple dedicated to their god Baal-Hamon. Archaeological excavations in the 1920s uncovered evidence of child sacrifice in the region. Moving over to ancient Egypt, they worshipped a bull deity named Apis. He was actually one of the very first gods to be associated with an animal, originally worshipped about 5,000 years ago. But unlike the bull god of the Canaanites, Apis wasn't so murderous. He instead represented the peaceful balance of the universe. Some believe the Canaanites took the idea of Apis and twisted it into their terrifying god, Moloch. Number 9. Danish dogs in South America. Vikings may very well have been in South America about 400 years before the Spanish. The evidence is shaky, but it is possible. One of the biggest contributors to this strange theory has to do with dogs. In 1885, researchers discovered a very specific variety of sheepdogs buried in an Inca grave. These dogs had been buried beside their mummified humans. This is because prior to the conquest of South America, it was fairly common for groups like the Inca to be buried with their best canine friends. Now here comes the coincidence. French scientists Madeleine Friand and H. Reichlen did an analysis of the sheepdog and found it not to be a descendant of wild South American dogs. Instead, it was directly related to the same dogs which have been discovered buried in Denmark, where the Vikings lived 1,000 years ago. According to these researchers, anatomical coincidence is anything but. These dogs are the same. There is no doubt about it. The big question now is trying to figure out how Danish dogs reached South America before the Spanish. The only reasonable explanation seems to be that it was the Vikings who brought them, although this hasn't been proven beyond any doubt. Number 8. The Spanish in Canada. Captain James Cook reached the west coast of North America in 1778. He sailed from England to what is now British Columbia and was thought to be the first foreigner to touch down in the soon-to-be country of Canada. But part of that story might be wrong. It may have actually been Spanish explorers who reached British Columbia first, and they may have been killed by Native Americans in the Okanagan Valley. For a long time, this theory has been a fringe conspiracy theory with locals in the valley, but more recently, archaeological evidence has turned the conspiracy theory into an unusual coincidence. For example, a Spanish sword from the 16th century was discovered buried in British Columbia, and unless that sword was dumped there coincidentally many years later, it would mean that Spanish explorers really arrived in North America 500 years ago. According to Dr. Stan Kopp from Langara College, it's 100% plausible. Historical records show that Spanish explorers did in fact reach Alaska in the 1700s, but overland expeditions never went farther north along the interior than Colorado or Arkansas. Dr. Stan Kopp says the legend is that Spanish explorers traveled up the Columbia River from the Oregon coast, wintered in Kelowna, then were ambushed by native warriors as they tried to head back south. And considering the sword that was discovered in British Columbia, this could have been a real thing. All archaeologists need now are the bodies of those lost explorers to confirm it. Number 7. The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, according to the Bible, was built by united humanity. Everyone had gotten together in harmony to build a massive tower that would reach heaven. God, angry that humanity thought they could just work together and build a giant walkway to heaven, destroyed the tower. Not only that, he broke apart humanity's single language into dozens of languages so that the people of Earth could no longer communicate with one another. God made it impossible for all humans to communicate through one central language. But here's the thing about the Tower of Babel. It wasn't only talked about in the Bible. The Quran has an almost identical story, but with slight differences. They don't mention the tower by name, saying only that an impressive construction was built in Egypt by the pharaoh so that he could climb to heaven and talk to God. But things get really crazy when we turn to Central America. They have an almost identical story in which a giant named Shelhua built the Great Pyramid of Cholula, which is an actual place and the biggest pyramid in the world, to storm heaven. But when the gods learned of the giant's plan, they destroyed the pyramid and fractured the language of the builders so that they could no longer communicate. This is almost identical to the biblical narrative, which is surprising considering the distance between these cultures. The Mesoamericans of Central America had nothing to do with the Babylonians or Judeans 2,000 years ago. And now for number 6. But first, I want to give a big shout out to Carmelie Nash and Shakia. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Number 6. Gobekli Tepe and Easter Island. There is a very interesting question that scientists and archaeologists could never answer. That question is, why are there humanoid statues at prehistoric sites all over the world with almost the same posture? These are statues all the way from Gobekli Tepe in Turkey to the statues of Easter Island. Many of these fantastic statues have very similar symbolic stances, almost as if the sculptors were inspired by the same things. Gobekli Tepe is one of the most mysterious archaeological sites that we know about. It dates back to 9600 BC and comprises unbelievably advanced architecture. There were also gigantic statues built here by people who didn't have sophisticated tools. The faces may not be clear on these statues, but they are obviously not human. They're gods, goddesses, or maybe even visitors from above. These statues on Easter Island are significantly newer. These were erected as recently as 500 years ago, and yet they look surprisingly similar to the statues carved at Gobekli Tepe over 12,000 years ago. It's highly unlikely that the Easter Islanders were a bunch of copycats. And even if these statues aren't exactly the same, their positions are the same. Standing tall, hands at the belly, a very distinct pose. Others like it have been found in Bolivia at Tiwanaku. We don't know why so many cultures made strikingly similar statues throughout history, but it does almost seem as if they came into contact with beings, human or otherwise, who looked identical. Do you think the posture is the same? Why do you think it is? Let me know in the comments below. Number 5. The Ancient Network. There is a pretty interesting claim floating around that says Stone Age people created an enormous underground network of tunnels 12,000 years ago. These tunnels were supposedly used as ancient superhighways to connect various civilizations all the way from Scotland on the island of Britain to Turkey on the border of Europe and Asia. According to German archaeologist Dr. Heinrich Kusk, there is evidence of this mysterious tunnel system if you know where to look for it. In Bavaria, archaeologists discovered an underground tunnel about 2,100 feet long. That's about twice as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall. In Austria, they found another one about 1,000 feet long. This is not for the claustrophobic. Most of these tunnels are only wide enough for one person to slowly slide through. There are all kinds of tunnels hidden underneath ancient Neolithic settlements. The only problem is that these tunnels don't actually connect. Most are just random tunnels a few hundred feet long, looking like enormous gopher holes. Still, Dr. Kusk insists they once formed a complex network like an underground ant nest across all of mainland Europe. How in the world they dug all of it by hand is harder to explain. Most archaeologists believe these tunnels were just niches used by local villagers to escape in times of violence. But seeing as they are indeed ancient, it's hard to prove or disprove any specific theory. Number 4. The Lady of Elche. The Lady of Elche was discovered in 1897 in Spain. This location is now a famous archaeological site called La Alcudia. This is a sculpture of a woman carved intricately out of limestone. Archaeologists believe it dates back to the 4th century BC, yet nobody knows exactly who she was supposed to represent. One theory is that she was the embodiment of an ancient deity known as Tanit, worshipped in Carthage. Tanit and her good friend Baal Hamon were the two most important gods in Carthage. She was a goddess of both war and fertility. But here's where things get tricky. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, there is an artifact from the 4th century BC that looks a lot like the Lady of Elche. But this artifact came from very far away, from West Bengal in India. The artifact isn't a sculpture, but a small terracotta plaque with the image of a woman on it. This woman not only looks like the Lady of Elche, but that has the same hairdo and everything. They could be twins, and yet they were found worlds apart. The artifact in the museum is a depiction of ladies with auspicious hairpins. They were Indian goddesses of war and battle, just like Tanit in Carthage was the goddess of war. Whether this is just a coincidence or if the goddesses are linked, historians don't know. The true identity of the Lady of Elche is also still a mystery. Number 3. Dolphins in Gaza. A statue from 2,000 years ago recently surfaced during archaeological excavations near Kibbutz Magen, which is near the Gaza Strip. The statue is of a dolphin clutching a fish in its mouth. It was discovered in the ruins of an old Byzantine site and was crafted during the era of the Romans. It stands only about 6 inches high and was probably part of a larger sculpture. It may even have been a part of a gigantic statue depicting a god or goddess, probably incorporated into a much newer building prior to the whole thing being mostly destroyed. Researchers say the statue could be a depiction of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, who according to legend was born from sea foam. Or it could be Poseidon, lord of all the seas. The mystery now is that nobody knows how such a statue ended up all the way over near the Gaza Strip. Sure, there was a temple to Aphrodite in the ancient port city of Ashkelon, but not here. Somebody must have taken the statue from somewhere else, brought it to this old Byzantine town, and then incorporated it into their own decorations. But how and why is still completely unknown. Number 2. Egyptians and the Maya. The Egyptians and the Maya never met. These people lived thousands of years apart and thousands of miles apart. As far as history is concerned, it was impossible for either civilization to have had an impact or an influence on the other. And yet they have an amazing number of similarities, starting with the pyramids. Over 2,000 years after the Egyptians built their pyramids, the Maya built their own. It was part of both people's cultural identities. But whereas the Egyptians used their pyramids for tombs, the Maya used theirs as temples and for ceremonies. They used the pyramids for totally different things, but it's still amazing to think they built similar structures, pulling the idea out of thin air. And then there's the hieroglyphics. Both these people developed a series of handwriting that used glyphs and pictures that convey an important meaning. But yet again, the hieroglyphics were different for each culture. For the Egyptians, you read the script from left to right, but for the Maya, you read it in a zigzag pattern. One pair of glyphs, then down to the next glyphs, then back up to the next two. This really confused researchers because they were trying to read the script left to right when that was all wrong. Both these cultures probably came up with all this stuff on their own, with no influence from some divine third party. It's just a major coincidence that with architecture, writing, and even religion, these two cultures were practically twins. Number 1. What do all early civilizations have in common? Almost every ancient civilization had 5 things in common. These aren't necessarily coincidences so much as they are the basic building blocks of human civilization. In the Paleolithic Age and the millennia following the end of the Ice Age, human beings were hunters and gatherers. They looked for plants, hunted animals, and wandered around following the seasons. The Neolithic Age changed all of that, and human society evolved. Nearly every early civilization on Earth started when they figured out how to plant their own food and domesticate animals. Goats, cows, pigs. Most crops were things like wheat, beans, and maize. Around this same time, most societies formed a hierarchy of power. People lived in groups of between 20 and 30 until they figured out farming. This was when groups of humans began moving into the triple digits. This was also when people realized somebody needed to be in charge, and this led to war and power struggles. The third thing civilizations had in common was industry. People had food now and had a safe place to sleep, so they started trading their extra goods to create commerce. Pieces of pottery, shiny jewels, clothing, and weapons. Then comes the architecture. Every major society went from living in huts and caves to actual houses. And then when religion came about, as it did in most places on the planet, humans began building impressive monuments to their gods and goddesses. Oddly enough, most of the early civilizations worshipped the same things. There was a goddess of fertility, rain, agriculture, and so on. And as time went on and society advanced, they came up with more deities to reflect their growing view of the world. Thanks for watching! What coincidence did you find the most shocking? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!